January 26, 1945. The forests near Holtzwihr, France, were frozen and silent beneath a pale winter sky. Snow clung to the ground in uneven patches, hardened by days of cold and churned into gray slush by the movement of men and machines. The German counteroffensive in the region had not yet fully collapsed, and scattered units still fought with determination, hoping to slow the relentless Allied advance toward the Rhine. Among the American forces holding a thin defensive line stood a 19-year-old second lieutenant named Audie Murphy. Small in stature, quiet by nature, and already carrying a record of battlefield decorations that would have overwhelmed many seasoned officers, Murphy commanded Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. That morning, he would face a test that would define not only his life, but one of the most extraordinary single acts of battlefield courage in modern warfare. The German attack began with artillery. Shells tore into the woods, shattering tree trunks and sending splinters slicing through the icy air. Communication lines faltered. Visibility dropped as smoke and debris filled the forest edge. Through the chaos came reports that German infantry, supported by armored vehicles, were advancing toward the American positions. The ground trembled as tracked machines pushed forward behind waves of foot soldiers. Company B was already under strength. Weeks of combat had reduced numbers. Ammunition was limited. The defensive perimeter was thin. Murphy assessed the situation quickly. If the German assault broke through here, it could unravel the entire sector. He ordered his men to fall back to more defensible positions in the woods, while he remained forward with a small group to coordinate artillery fire. It was not a theatrical gesture, it was calculation. He understood that holding the line for even minutes could prevent encirclement. As the Germans pressed closer, American tank destroyers maneuvered to respond. One of them, an M10 tank destroyer, was hit directly. Flames erupted from its hull. The crew bailed out, retreating toward cover as ammunition inside the vehicle began to cook off in violent bursts. The disabled machine burned intensely, black smoke rising against the white sky. German infantry continued advancing. Murphy now stood near the flaming wreck, exposed, aware that retreating would leave the approaching force unchallenged. He radioed for artillery support, adjusting coordinates while enemy fire intensified. Bullets snapped through branches overhead. The forest no longer felt silent, it roared. Then Murphy made a decision that defied conventional expectation. He climbed on to the M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle was ablaze, its metal heated dangerously, its interior ammunition detonating unpredictably. Yet its .50 caliber machine gun remained operational. Standing atop the wreck, silhouetted against smoke and flame, Murphy began firing directly into the advancing German troops. The heavy weapon thundered, cutting through infantry formations attempting to move forward under cover of trees. From the German perspective, the scene must have appeared surreal. Through drifting smoke, they saw concentrated fire erupting from an armored position that should have been destroyed. The volume of fire suggested organized resistance, perhaps multiple machine gun nests concealed along the defensive line. In reality, it was a single officer, exposed, balancing atop a burning vehicle, feeding belt after belt of ammunition into the weapon. Murphy maintained constant communication with American artillery units, calmly calling in strikes even as he fired. Shells began landing closer to the German advance, disrupting formations and forcing them to seek cover. The combination of machine gun fire and accurate artillery created the illusion of a larger defensive force. German soldiers hesitated. Some pulled back temporarily, unsure of the strength opposing them. The engagement stretched on. Minutes in combat do not pass like ordinary minutes. Each second stretches, magnified by adrenaline and risk. Murphy remained on the tank destroyer for nearly an hour. Flames crept closer. Ammunition inside the hull continued exploding in bursts. At any moment, the entire vehicle could have detonated catastrophically. Yet he stayed. German return fire intensified. Bullets struck around him. Splinters tore through his clothing. At one point, he was wounded in the leg. Blood seeped into the snow below. Still, he did not descend. Behind him, American infantry regrouped in defensive positions, drawing strength from the unexpected resistance unfolding ahead. What they saw was not reckless heroism, but controlled defiance, a refusal to surrender ground at a critical moment. German commanders, observing the stalled advance, faced confusion. Reports indicated heavy resistance supported by artillery. The burning armored vehicle appeared to remain operational. Movement in the tree line suggested entrenched forces. Uncertain of American strength and concerned about mounting casualties, the attacking unit slowed its push. Murphy's ammunition finally began running low. The machine gun barrel smoked heavily. His wounded leg throbbed beneath him. When the immediate German assault faltered, he leapt from the tank destroyer and withdrew toward his company's position. The flames behind him intensified, consuming what remained of the vehicle. Reaching his men, Murphy refused evacuation despite his injury. Instead, he reorganized Company B and ordered a counterattack. Inspired by the resistance they had just witnessed, the soldiers advanced with renewed determination. German forces, believing they faced a stronger defensive presence, withdrew further than expected. The line held. The immediate tactical result was clear. The German attack had been repelled. But the psychological impact extended beyond that frozen field in France. Murphy's action had transformed perception. For the German unit, the sudden concentrated fire from a supposedly destroyed armored position suggested depth and resilience. For American soldiers nearby, it demonstrated that a thin line could hold if anchored by resolve. It bought time for artillery, time for reinforcement, time for stabilization. In official reports later compiled, estimates suggested that Murphy's defense inflicted significant casualties and disrupted a coordinated assault that could have broken through vulnerable terrain. His composure under fire became the defining element of the account. He had not charged recklessly. He had calculated. He had chosen the one position that offered elevation, visibility, and firepower, even if it burned beneath him. The battlefield itself bore witness to the aftermath. Snow melted in irregular patterns where flames had spread. Spent shell casings littered the ground around the M10. Tree trunks were scarred by gunfire. Silence gradually returned as smoke thinned into the cold air. News of the action traveled through the regiment quickly. Soldiers repeated the story in tones that mixed disbelief with admiration. Some embellished details, others simply described what they had seen, a lone figure standing atop fire, refusing to yield. For many, it became a symbol of the final months of the war in Europe, when exhaustion and attrition pressed hard on both sides. Audie Murphy would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, but at the moment itself, there were no cameras, no ceremony, no dramatic music. There was only the crack of rifle fire, the weight of decision, and the understanding that retreat meant collapse. As winter light faded over Holzwihr, Company B remained in position. The German attack had failed. The line held firm. And somewhere beyond the forest, the broader machinery of war continued grinding forward towards its inevitable conclusion. But on that single frozen day, on the hull of a burning tank destroyer, one officer stood alone, and for nearly an hour convinced an enemy force that they faced far more than a single man.
The smoke over Holzwihr did not clear immediately. Even after the German assault broke and the firing slowed to scattered shots in the distance, a gray haze lingered over the tree line, hanging low against the winter sky. The burning M10 tank destroyer eventually collapsed inward, its ammunition fully spent, its twisted metal frame blackened and split by heat. Around it, the snow was melted into muddy craters stained with oil and blood. What had happened there would soon pass into official reports, but in that moment it was simply a battlefield, cold, scarred, and quiet again. Audie Murphy finally allowed a medic to examine his wounded leg. The injury, though painful, was not immediately life-threatening. Shrapnel and fragments had torn into the muscle, and his uniform was stiff with frozen blood. When pressed to withdraw for proper treatment, he resisted at first. His company was still under strength, every man mattered. But command insisted. Reluctantly, Murphy was escorted rearward. As he was led away from the line, some of the soldiers he had just reorganized watched him in silence. They had seen him silhouetted against flames, firing steadily while artillery crashed down around him. They had expected at any moment to see the entire tank destroyer erupt in a catastrophic explosion. Yet he had remained. That image, a single figure atop fire, unflinching, etched itself into their memory more deeply than any speech could have. For the German unit that had advanced through those woods, the experience was equally transformative, though in a different way. After-action accounts suggested confusion during the assault. Intelligence had indicated a weakened American position. Resistance was expected, but not concentrated machine gun fire from an armored vehicle believed destroyed. Artillery had landed with precision. Reports from forward elements described coordinated defense. The attacking commander, facing mounting casualties and uncertain of enemy strength, made the decision to pull back and reassess. In war, hesitation can alter momentum. That hesitation bought the Americans critical time. Within hours, reinforcements strengthened the sector. Defensive positions were consolidated, communication lines restored. The fragile gap the Germans had hoped to exploit closed. Murphy was transported to a field hospital where doctors cleaned and treated his wound more thoroughly. As he lay on a cot beneath canvas, the noise of distant artillery filtered faintly through the winter air. The war had not paused. Across the Western Front, Allied forces continued pressing eastward, crossing rivers, seizing towns, compressing what remained of German resistance. But in that tent, for the first time that day, there was stillness. Officers began compiling reports of the engagement almost immediately. Witness statements were taken, coordinates verified, the destruction of the M10 documented. It was standard procedure, yet the tone in these reports carried something more, recognition that what had occurred was extraordinary. Murphy himself remained characteristically restrained when questioned. He described the tactical necessity of holding the line, the availability of the machine gun, the need to direct artillery accurately. He did not dramatize the flames. He did not emphasize the risk. To him, it had been a decision under pressure. The alternative, withdrawal without resistance, would have endangered his men. News of the action traveled beyond the regiment in the following days. By then, Murphy was already known within certain circles for previous acts of bravery in Italy and France. But this moment crystallized his reputation.
Here was a young officer who had refused to abandon a position even when isolated, who had transformed a burning wreck into a defensive strongpoint. The symbolism resonated deeply during the final months of the European War. Allied forces were advancing, but resistance remained fierce in pockets. Casualties continued to mount. Morale, though generally strong, was strained by fatigue and the brutal winter conditions. Stories like Murphy's provided a focal point, evidence that individual resolve could influence broader outcomes. For historians examining the battle later, the tactical significance lay not merely in the number of enemy casualties inflicted, but in the disruption of momentum. German forces in early 1945 were increasingly reactive, attempting localized counterattacks to delay inevitable defeat. Success depended on exploiting weak seams in Allied lines. At Holzwihr, such a seam briefly existed. Murphy's stand sealed it. Weeks later, as the Allied push carried troops across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany, formal recognition arrived. Audie Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The citation described conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It noted his solitary stand, his direction of artillery fire, his refusal to withdraw despite wounds. Yet even as the medal was presented, the broader war machine continued forward. Cities fell, prison camps were liberated, the Third Reich's remaining defenses crumbled under combined assault. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, only months after that frozen morning in France. Murphy returned home as one of the most decorated American soldiers of the war. Parades followed. Applause echoed through city streets far removed from the smoke of Holzwihr. But like many veterans, he carried the weight of what he had witnessed. The battlefield image that the public celebrated was only one fragment of a much larger, harsher reality. The burning tank destroyer became legend, a symbol repeated in newspapers and later retold in books and films. But stripped of mythology, it remains a study in battlefield leadership under extreme pressure. A wounded officer assessing terrain, recognizing opportunity in wreckage, understanding that perception can be as decisive as firepower. The German unit believed they faced a battalion because the volume and precision of resistance suggested depth. In truth, they faced one man, leveraging every available asset. On that January day, courage did not roar. It calculated. It climbed. It fired steadily while flames rose beneath its boots. And in doing so, it altered the course of a battle that might otherwise have broken through. Long after the snow melted in the forests of France, the story endured. Not simply because it was dramatic, but because it illustrated a fundamental truth of war. Sometimes the difference between collapse and survival rests on a single decision made in seconds, under fire, with no guarantee of survival. Audie Murphy had made that decision. Alone atop a burning machine, he held the line. And for the German soldiers advancing through smoke that morning, it felt as though an entire battalion stood in their path.